We begin with Gloria Steinem. She is, as you know, a key figure in the feminist movement. She was galvanized into activism as a young reporter covering the struggle for abortion rights. Her work as an activist and writer helped bring feminism from the fringes into the mainstream, she along with many others. And she forever changed the roles of men and women at home and in the workplace. Her latest book was the best-selling Revolution from Within, which brought new insight into the psychological issues facing all of us, especially women. Her new book is called Moving Beyond Words, and it offers her perspective on 6 important concerns, and I'm pleased to have her here. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
This is great to see you. Let me just talk about this book a little. You talk about the workplace, you talk about reaching 60 and thoughts about that, making you more radical, and you talk about a number of things, but I guess Freud is the one that first jumps out at you. Tell me what you were saying about Mr. Freud that brings him up for reevaluation.
Well, I wouldn't have brought him up for reevaluation if he weren't still very much with us, not only in the therapy world, but also in the popular culture. But I was really just trying to do a little satire and say, well, what if Freud were Phyllis?
If it was Phyllis, right.
Yeah,
if Sigmund was Phyllis.
Yeah, because I think that reversal is a very good technique for detecting bias in ourselves and in others. And I'm always doing it when I read the paper. You know, Bush goes to Japan, and I think to myself, what would have happened if a female chief of state had thrown up on the Japanese and fainted? You know, I mean, I always try to use this as a sort of little tactic.
Yes.
And
well, let's take that. What would have happened if a female head of state had thrown up?
Well, I think it would have been perceived with much less ridicule, much more ridicule, and much less, you know, sort of covering up the what. Yeah, right. But this started out to be that kind of little fantasy. Well, of course, Phyllis Freud would say that men were terminally narcissistic and fragile because having their genitals perched so precariously on the outside, you know, dictated this, and men would be subject to womb envy and, you know, all of these things. Right. But then it grew and grew into something much more than that, because I started to read not only what Freud had written that I had not read previously, but also what he had written that hadn't been previously published until a few years ago. And the more I read, the more there grew next to this satire a serious sequence of footnotes which have their own title called The Watergate of the Western World, in which it's not only the craziness of his theories, which really were his own life history imposed on the lives of his patients.
Let me stop you there, because I mean, it turns out, which we discovered from the letters, that a lot of what he was, a lot of his theory and a lot of his practice as a psychoanalyst came from his own life experiences, which he was projecting forward.
Well, I think we should have known, and many people did know before, because he was constantly diagnosing people as being totally, I don't know, at war with the same gender parent and in love with the opposite gender parent. He consistently said that masturbation caused neurosis, but cocaine was just fine. I mean, this was based on his experience of having been convinced as a child that if he touched himself in masturbation, he would be castrated. And so, I mean, all of this
because his
craziness,
father had told him.
Yeah, and this was not universal in the culture, incidentally. People always excuse him by saying he was a product of his time, but that's not really the case. But I think that what we learned that was new from the letters is that he says that his, quote, you know, my father was one of those perverts who is responsible for the hysteria and neuroses of my siblings, for instance. I mean, he accuses his father of sexual abuse. And you know, it's likely that it happened to him if it happened to his siblings, and he also accuses a nurse who was his nurse until he was about 3. And there are these, you know, sad, tragic glimpses, fragments of memories that come back. He, at that point, is believing his patients when they tell him that they have been sexually abused. They don't so much tell him as that they reveal it, you know, involuntarily almost. And he notices, for instance, that those who have had their heads held for sexual purposes, that is for oral sex when they're babies and little children, still experience very severe headaches. Well, he, of course, experienced very severe headaches all his life, which was why he took cocaine. Then we come to the period of his father's death. And he, really hated and had great contempt for his father. He didn't expect to be disturbed, terribly disturbed by the old man's death, as he put it. But in fact, it brought up, we know not what, but I mean, in his words, he was uprooted, he couldn't write, he couldn't read, he couldn't think, he couldn't, it's as if all these memories started to come back. And over a 2 or 3 year period, he then succeeds in denying them and in burying them again, and consequently has to say they are also not true in his patients.
Why do you think he, sort of the father of psychoanalysis held it that way in some places, has such a hold even today? Those who say that or suggest that Freud is dead are dead wrong.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, and he keeps resurging.
Yes.
Even.
Why is it? I mean,
well, I think that one clue is this: he's much more popular. He always was much more popular in this country than he was in Europe, where he came from. And I think that's because the challenge of the suffragist and abolitionist movements, which were just at their peak, really, as he came along, and were challenging the sexual caste systems and the idea of hierarchy itself, were very threatening. Religion was no longer working to provide a rationale for the status quo. So along came Freud with a pseudo-scientific rationale that supported the status quo, and I think he was seized on for that reason.
And how many Freudian psychiatrists and psychoanalysts would you think, are they primarily men, you think?
They're primarily men, but there are some women.
Who?
Yeah, who really, I mean, it's a sort of a big academic, gigantic way of fitting into the male system, of seeking male approval, of making an elaborate specialty and rationale out of the position we're already in, which is sometimes comforting.
Let me move to reaching 60. There's a whole, the back has even a quote here, which you said, I've always had 2 or more tracks running in my head. The pleasurable one was thinking forward to some future scene, imagining what would be planning, which should be planning on the edge of fantasy. The other played underneath and all too realistic fragments of what I should have done. There it was in perfect microcosm, the past and future coming together to squeeze out the present. Reflect for me. You say you get more radical at 60.
Yeah, I think this is something that happens to a lot of women. I don't
Just
mean
women, you think?
No, I'm not trying to say that it's all women or all men, but I think there's this cultural pattern, which is that women tend to be more conservative when we're young, right, and get more activist and radical as we get older, whereas men tend to be more rebellious and activist in youth and grow more conservative because they gain power as they grow older, by and large, and we lose power.
How is your radicalism, as it gains at 60, manifest? Is it in terms of political views, in terms of how you see the culture, in terms of how you behave? What?
All of the above. I mean, it's a continuation. It isn't as if it's a complete departure.
You got to 60 and all of a sudden, whoa, I can be free.
Right. Yeah. But it is some of that, though, because what happens is that now there is no more prescription for you on the patriarchal map, because that ends when you're about 50. Yeah. So it's scary and you become invisible. I mean, this happens to older men too, but I think it happens even more to older women. But it also sets you free.
There's no prescription for you in a sense. What do you mean?
Well, you've played out the female role. There is no more female role. Right. You've raised your children and that's it, you know. So scary as it may be, now you're free to be who you really are. You know, it's most comparable in my experience anyway to being a little girl of 8, 9, or 10. Yeah. Because then you were very often this clear-eyed little androgynous creature, you know, climbing trees and with this kind of shit-free attitude, and you knew who you were and everything. Yes. And then along came the feminine role and kind of messed you up until you were 50, you know, or 40 or something. And it's like going back to that clear-eyed, you know, little feisty androgynous person, only now you have your own apartment and you have a little freedom in the world, or at least if you're very lucky, you do. I mean, the other reality of this country is that it has a lot of problems. I mean, women over 65 are the single poorest demographic group in the country, and there's all the problems of healthcare and housing and so on. We can't ever forget that. But intrinsically, I'm finding that this stage of life is really as exciting and interesting and new as adolescence was after childhood, or young adulthood was after adolescence. There's this whole new period that nobody told us about.
Yeah, and I mean, is there? Betty Friedan has written her book about aging. Is there a book in that any of these essays, whether it is Freud looking at sort of the impact of psychoanalysis on the development of...
Freud incidentally said that old women were the worst people, I quote him in there, were the most dyspeptic, terrible, awful people in the world. You couldn't get along with them. I mean, precisely because they probably became rebellious.
I think, I mean, this is not exactly what you're talking about, but for me, in my experiences, the most wonderful people in the world are older women because of just what you're saying. It is the feistiness, one, and secondly, the spirit that they have, which is a feistiness, and I don't care attitude. There are no bounds in terms of what they will say and in terms of how they react. There's an authenticity. Whatever the shedding that's taken place, it makes them the most wonderful people to be around.
And I hadn't thought of it.
And I see them at lectures and wherever I go, because then they're more interested in... Go ahead.
Yeah, well, until you just said that, I didn't think about this, but I bet it's true that it's a pleasure for men as well, because then we don't inflict the role on you.
Yes.
Either. We let you be more free, too.
Yeah, there is a reaction to that. How do you see how you want to spend your time? I mean, is it you want to be writing essays and somehow looking at what might be an agenda for women or for society and trying to have an impact, trying to make a difference?
Yeah, I think, we're all trying to make a difference in whatever way is accessible to us, and mine happens to be writing, and to a lesser extent, because I'm still not as at ease with it, speaking and traveling.
Ease with writing?
No, speaking and traveling. Speaking, yes. I mean, I started out to be a writer. I'd never spoken in public until I was about 35 years old, but courtesy of the movement now, I've grown into being an organizer, which I love, actually, which is, because I am kind of scared of speaking, I love to get a group of people together and make the group take over, And when somebody over here asks a question and somebody over here answers it, then I know that, it's working.
That's like a good show. That's what works. When this show works when I have to do less, when you are reacting to who's here or something, and if you have a group, therefore it's a better show. Do you ever say to yourself what might have been A, or B, what I might have wanted to have been? And if you do, what are the answers?
I know this may sound bizarre, but I don't, actually.
Not on
I don't. No, I used to try to make myself say that, because I realized that conventionally I was supposed to.
Yes.
So I used to think to myself, well, suppose I'd had this child, or suppose I'd married this man, or taken it, but I could never. I could never.
You could never imagine yourself there.
No, I just couldn't dredge up a regret, because it's just so interesting right now. Well, one regret, which is wasting time. I mean, it isn't so much that I would have done different things, but I would have done them faster.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean?
Well, I think I kept on doing things that I already knew how to do, rather than forging into the unknown. And I kept on responding to people's requests. Instead of asking the revolutionary question, what do I want to do? The 12-step movement talks about codependency. That's really just, a codependent is a well-socialized woman.
Yeah. I didn't know that.
Well, that's what it is. And that's, that's what I was, too. And still am, in many ways. I mean, you're always struggling with it.
You are? Still?
Sure,
In what way are you still that, though? I mean, still, in a sense, codependent or a well-socialized woman?
Well, I mean, if codependent means that if somebody has a problem and I can conceivably, possibly think of the solution, I feel like I have to present it.
You have to be there.
Last night I did a book signing. There was a woman there who I never saw before in my life who needed a job and was looking for something. I found myself this morning going to elaborate lengths with her name and address to try to find this woman a job.
Now, why did you do that? Because you can't say no, because
I can't say no, but also
Mother Gloria.
Because I get a well, that's a good question. I'll think about it this afternoon. Why did I do that?
Yeah, but you do it because you have been doing it for a while. Then I mean, it's been part of your own life experience.
Well, yes, and I mean, I was socialized to do it. At least now, instead of doing it in the conventional way, that is, instead of supporting people who don't support me, and being a servant in some sense, I'm doing it for a movement that is making changes that is, that are life and death to me too.
You must have been pleased when you saw the bipartisan solidarity among the senators with respect to Admiral Kelso in the Senate that must have transcended party lines. Yes, no, maybe.
Yeah, no. Well, I think that I'm all in favor of people who want to be in the military. Is that what you mean?
No, Kelso was up. He had been in charge of the Navy during the time of the tailhook investigation,
right?
And they were going to retire him as a 4-star admiral. And some people came to the Senate floor. All the women from Republicans and Democrats got together and said,
"Yeah, no, I do support." He was held responsible. I mean, the buck stops here is not a phrase I invented. That's the phrase of the military and other hierarchies.
Well, my question was a different one. My notion was that here it transcended party lines and all the there's a whole spectrum of different experiences.
But party lines, a friend of mine who's an actress once said to me this brilliant thing. She said, "I've been married to one Marxist and one fascist, and neither one took the garbage out."
Yes,
okay?
I remember you said
and
that.
ever since then, I've used that as the sort of little paradigm of the fact that to talk about patriarchy and racism is to go much deeper than party labels. I mean, you'll find a great deal of working together across lines in the Congress.
Where is the movement today? I mean, when you think of the first stage, which I guess was suffragettes and those kinds of things, and then the second wave was when you were involved and Friedan and others who were there changing things, and then the third stage, I'm not quite sure what it is. What is it?
Well, actually, the first wave lasted about 150 years,
right.
In order to gain a legal identity as human beings for women of all races and men of color in the suffragist and abolitionist movements, which were very much intertwined. So this second wave really is going to last at least a century in order to get legal and social equality. If it took that long to get identity, to get the much more complex issues of equality, will certainly, by all historical precedent, take a century. So, the third wave is a bit of a misnomer. But I don't care. I mean, if we can call ourselves anything we want. If young women want to call themselves a third wave, that's great. But historically, it's actually all still one.
But how would you? I mean, what are they? What is the common definition of the third wave? Would you say?
Young women. I mean,
young women who are saying
young women who are the daughters. It's like my daughter. In fact, it is my goddaughter, Rebecca Walker, who you had on the show.
Who was terrific. Yes.
Who was one of the inventors of the third wave. So it is literally our daughters, who are wonderful.
And what are the issues that are different for them than they are, say?
Well, I think that first of all, they have much higher expectations. I'm so grateful to them because they teach me all the time. They are just much more shit-free than I am. And they say things like, when you go on television, why do you smile all the time? You don't have to smile. You're talking about something serious. I said, I know, but I've been socialized.
Right? Yes.
Right. So their higher expectations are extraordinarily precious and wonderful, and they're also taking other additional subjects. I mean, there is no subject that isn't affected by the looking at it as if women mattered. But they are able to go, whereas we were having to work very hard just to talk about equal pay and reproductive freedom and equal political access and so on. They're going on to look at voting rights, to see that erotica is different from pornography in the same way that sex is not rape. They're carrying on the issues and deepening and diversifying the issues.
Moving beyond words, Gloria Steinem. Moving beyond words means?
It has two meanings, really. One is moving, emotionally moving, because it comes from a quote, something like, I have seen brave women on the outer edge of history with no maps to guide them and a courage to make themselves vulnerable that I find moving beyond words. And then it also comes from another quote, which is essentially saying now we have, our dreams at least are more free than they used to be. We have tools now in the sense of legislation and, how to organize and so on. And so we're free to move beyond the meaning of words we have, in fact, because words come from the past. And one day we'll look back and we'll see that the dreams we had now were just little posts along the road, of where we've already been.
Gloria Steinem, Moving Beyond Words. Thank you. Great to see you. Next up, men, how they see themselves as reflected from the perspective of two editors of magazines, not necessarily men's magazines anymore, but dealing with subjects that are sometimes of interest to men. Back in a moment. Stay with us. The editor of Esquire and the editor of GQ.